So, Gary, thank you for being here. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Corey.
So, watching Forrest Gump as a young kid and seeing Lieutenant Dan, your performance, and then now 30 years later to see you still really involved with service members and supporting them. I mean, it's just amazing what you've been doing.
Oh, thank you. Well, how old were you when you saw that movie?
So, I was born in 96. So, I,
Okay. Well, the movie came out in 94.
yeah, so I was probably around 5 or 6. And that was my first because it was a good introduction to a war film. I feel like it's a good balance you could show a kid.
Yeah, it's there's a few things, that might be a little tricky there for kids, but
Yeah,
it's a damn good movie. It's a really good one.
it is. And so, starting, you had members in World War One, and how did you first get interested in the military whenever you were coming up?
Gosh, well, yeah, my family members, I think, were the first thing. Although I think it was almost the family members on my wife's side of the family that kind of really affected me most with regards to veterans, because my grandfather was World War One. He died. He was in his 70s when he died, and he died in the 70s. I was probably, I don't know. I was probably in my late teens, early 20s when he died. As a youngster, unfortunately, and I regret this, but there was nothing I could do. I never really talked to my grandfather about World War One because I was a kid and I just didn't think about it. There was a uniform in a trunk in the basement and some old stuff that I remember, but Granddad never really talked about what he did over there in World War One. And darn it, now I wish that I had been more aware to ask him about that particular time of his life. He was an ambulance driver in France during the Battle of the Argonne, and the Argonne, if you know that military history, that was probably the most the number of casualties in that particular battle. One battle, it was like 26,000 were killed in that battle, the Battle of the Argonne Forest. And he was an ambulance driver going back and forth from the front line to the rear, with wounded. He never really talked about it too much, but one of his sons, my dad was the youngest of three boys, and then one in the middle, my Uncle Jerry, was a World War II veteran, and he was a writer. He ended up being a writer, and he got my grandfather to talk a little bit about some of his World War One history, and he wrote it down. So those are kind of the accounts I have of my grandfather. As I said, he had three sons. He and my grandmother. He met my grandmother at this army camp up in northern Illinois. She was an army nurse during that period of time in the early 1900s. And they got married, had three sons. My Uncle Jack ended up going off to war in the Army Air Corps in World War II. He was a navigator on a B-17 bomber. And then the middle of the three sons, my Uncle Jerry, was on a ship in the Pacific. He was 18 years old. He graduated high school and beelined for the Navy and made it into the war. I mean, he was part of the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa.
Oh, wow.
And then he was on what you call a landing ship tank. Those were the ships that carried tanks, and they would drop the ramp down, and then tanks would roll out onto the beach. And so my Uncle Jerry was on one of those ships during Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and then he was part of the occupying force in Japan after the end of the war. So there's a couple of accounts where he remembers, I mean, just imagine that. It was hard to tell the Japanese that the war was over. So they were always, when they saw planes coming in,
Hmm.
they were always worried because some of those Japanese planes didn't know the war was over
Hmm.
and didn't know that the Japanese had surrendered. And so they always had to be on guard, even when the war had ended.
Yeah,
And
because I think there was accounts of people 20, 30 years later on some of those islands in the Pacific still thinking the war was going
they
on.
didn't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very strange. And the U.S. troops that were in that area had to be had to really be aware. So if, you're on a ship and you hear airplanes coming, everybody's on guard because they don't know if they're Japanese planes that are just they're just moving to land somewhere, or if they're on the attack.
Mhm.
So my Uncle Jerry wrote a bit about that. And then he also served in the Korean War. He was on a ship during Korea. And then my dad, he was the youngest of the three, and he joined the Navy. He went to college for about 3 months out of high school, and it wasn't for him, and so he joined the Navy, and he was in during the Korean War. So that was my side of the family. And then when I met my wife, her two brothers served in Vietnam. Her sister joined the Army, married a Vietnam veteran, combat medic. They had a son. He served in Afghanistan 2 tours. So a lot of military in my family. And that's, when you ask sort of where it sort of began, I think it probably began there. And as I said, though, never talked to my grandfather about it. My Uncle Jerry ended up living in Texas, so I didn't really talk to him about his service in World War II, only what I read that he wrote. And then the oldest of the three sons, the navigator on the B-17, that was my Uncle Jack. And I got to spend a good amount of time with Uncle Jack before he died. And so I got Uncle Jack to talk. In fact, there's a little documentary that's probably findable on the internet called Uncle Jack.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I got very involved with the Disabled American Veterans Organization years ago, and they were very involved with the Warbird organization, these old World War II planes. And I asked some of my pals at the DAV, do you know where there's a B-17 that's still flying that I could maybe get my Uncle Jack on one of those planes? And so we surprised Uncle Jack with a trip on a B-17. He hadn't been on it since his last mission in 1945 over Europe.
Oh, wow.
We surprised him, and we made a little movie of it. It's about a little 12-minute movie of Uncle Jack's ride on the B-17 for the first time in years since the war. And that was beautiful. You see the look on his face when he crawls up in there and he gets to that position of where the navigator would sit, and he's just looking out the window, and you could see you can see his mind kind of racing back when they would take off and when they would be flying, and the things that were going through his head on every mission. He did 30 missions over Europe.
Wow. And there's some organizations I've seen that every year on the anniversary of D-Day, they take the vets out and they can jump if they want to.
Yeah, they can jump. And I narrated a documentary called Into Flight Once More. That was, I think it was maybe it was the 75th anniversary or something. And all these old warbirds went flying over Europe, and they documented all this stuff. It's called Into Flight Once More. You can look it up at GarySinise.com. It's on there. Good documentary. But as I was saying, the Vietnam veterans on my wife's side of the family, probably they were the ones who influenced me the most, because they were just a little bit older than I was. When I was in high school, they were off in Vietnam, and I got pretty close with my wife's brothers.
And you met your wife, she was an actress at Steppenwolf in your 20s, about?
Yeah, she went to college with a bunch of my buddies.
Oh,
and one of my buddies from high school went down to Illinois State University and met some of the original members of Steppenwolf down there. And my wife, Moira, was one of the original members of Steppenwolf back in the mid 70s. And she joined the company, and we fell in love. 5 years later, we got married, and we've been together ever since. And she introduced me to her brothers, her
Wow.
sister, who served in the Army, her sister's husband,
And
and
so you were
I was
about
them.
20 whenever you started, or I guess teenage years when you started really getting into acting?
I got into acting in high school. Yeah, I was 16
Ah.
when I started. Did my first play in high school at 16 in my sophomore year. And then I just wanted to do plays all the way through high school. And then when I got out of high school, I wanted to keep doing plays, but I didn't want to go to college. So I started a theater company, and we call it Steppenwolf. And that company is now in its 51st year.
Wow.
It got started in 1974, and it's a giant multi-theater, multi-million-dollar complex now, and it was started by teenagers. It's really interesting to look at the history of it and how it got started and where it is today.
So when you started with that, I mean, you're at a high school and you don't know if this is going to work. And a lot of people get in the creative world, they don't know if it's going to work or not. Did you ever have moments of maybe I should go and do something else, or were you just full steam ahead and it worked out?
No, always. Oh, I mean, everybody was wondering, like, how long am I going to do this? How long will it last? Should we break up? I mean, we went through a lot of things. Maybe we should close our doors. It's getting a little
Mhm.
too tough. But we always toughed it out because we did like working together in those early days.
Mhm.
John Malkovich was one of the members back then. Laurie Metcalf, Joan Allen. These are people that went on to
Mhm.
have great careers, Oscar nominations, all that kind of thing. There was a great early group, and we did enjoy doing the work together. We really found
Mhm.
a lot of artistic sort of satisfaction in working together, and that kind of always helped us through those moments of self-doubt and whether we should keep going, because it was getting harder and nobody
Mhm.
was making any money, and it was sometimes nobody would show up to see our plays, all this stuff. I write about this pretty extensively in a book that came out in 2019, Grateful American.
Mhm.
And I write about those early days of Steppenwolf. There's some pretty funny stories from back then.
Oh man. So just having the passion and doing it for the right reasons is really what kept you on the path. You're like, hey, even if I'm not making money, I just love doing this.
Yeah, we didn't make any money. I mean, like I said, I was 18 when it started. We were just kids wanting to do plays, and then we ended up getting securing this space in a basement of a closed down Catholic school. There was a big basement, big wide open space, and we asked them if we could use it to build a theater in there, and we ended up building a 88 seat little theater inside this basement, and we did plays in there, and we didn't make any money. Um, we charged like $3 for tickets, and everybody had day jobs.
Mhm.
So we would, everybody was doing different day jobs to support themselves. This was back when we were, 19, 20 years old.
Mhm.
Day jobs to support ourselves. And then we would go to the theater, you'd finish work at your day job. I was working a couple of different things. I was a landscaper on the landscape crew for a big outdoor festival kind of place. Had a
Mhm.
big 4,000 seat amphitheater in it and giant lawn. It's called Ravinia Festival in
Mhm.
Highland Park, Illinois. It's pretty well known in that area. They get great acts there, and I worked there for a while. And then I also worked on the loading dock at Neiman Marcus, unpacking boxes and unloading trucks. And I would do that and then go to the theater at night. And everybody had their day job. Malkovich was a school bus driver, and he worked at a stationery store. And Jeff Perry made egg rolls at an egg roll fast food place. I mean, we all had different ridiculous types of jobs to sustain ourselves because we were young.
Mhm.
You don't need that much, really. We're all sharing apartments, so we
Wow.
split the rent with each other in all these different apartments we had. And and then we'd go to the theater at night and work on our plays. And so we, eventually we moved out of the city of Highland Park into the city of Chicago. And then we had our board of directors got a little stronger. We were able to start paying ourselves a little bit of money. We started to raise a little bit more money because our plays were good and people really did like our company. And so we were growing, getting pretty good reviews. And the theater just grew from nothing into this massive theater complex on the north side of Chicago right now. It's a multi-million-dollar complex.
So are you still involved with Steppenwolf to this day, or did you?
No, not that much. I mean, I'll help raise a little money here and there, but for the first 27 to 30 years, 25 to 30 years, I was very, very active with the company. And then September 11th happened. And the last play I did was in 2001. I closed it about 6 weeks before the attack on our country.
Wow.
And it was a revival of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And I was doing it on Broadway. And we closed it at the end of July. And then 6 weeks later, we were attacked. And I started raising my hand for the USO and supporting all these military charities and doing all these different things. And I got CSI New York, the television series. I started doing that. And then I just haven't been back to do anything at the theater since.
So with Steppenwolf, when that started to take off, how did that translate into your career starting in Hollywood and films and TV?
Well, we, as I said, we started in the basement.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing story.
We were down below ground. We started below ground, then we eventually came above ground, moved into the city. We were kind of a well-known secret in the Highland Park area of the north side of, northern suburbs of Chicago. We were a good group of young actors that were doing some pretty, kind of intense rock and roll theater. That's what they started dubbing us as back then. When the critics would review our plays, they kind of dubbed us as this rock and roll theater. And so we were doing some pretty hard hitting things and we got good reviews. We were growing. I started, then I took over as the artistic director of the theater once we moved into the city of Chicago. One of the things I wanted to do early on as artistic director, because I really thought we were good, and we were. And I wanted to start moving our plays to New York City to get reviewed by international critics. And, ultimately we had designs on building our own building someday. But I think, first we wanted to move our shows and see how they would do in another city. And we moved one of our plays that John Malkovich and I were doing called True West. And it was a big hit. Nice. It was the play that really launched Malkovich into the movie business. A lot of people came to see it, movie producers and directors and all that stuff. And it put Steppenwolf kind of on the map. People didn't know who Steppenwolf was until that play in 1982. And all of a sudden people are writing about Steppenwolf. Who are these people from Chicago? And, wow, this is cool. And, all this stuff. You got to go see this play. And so, it was a big hit there. John and I did it for 6 months and I was the director of it too. And I kept directing other casts in the play. When John and I closed, he went off and started doing movies, but then we started moving other shows to New York. And every time we'd move a show, it was a hit. People were just digging on Steppenwolf at that time. And within 3 years of starting to move our plays to New York, our regional theater received the Tony Award for Best Regional Theater in the country.
Wow. So how many years from starting in the basement to the Tony? How many years was that?
Well, we started in the basement in 1976, and we got that Tony Award in 1985. And we started moving our shows to other places.
Mhm.
We started taking them overseas, and we started taking them to Washington, D.C. We did that summer that we won the Tony Award. We had a play running in Chicago. We had a play running in New York that was a big hit called Orphans.
Mhm.
I directed it, big hit there. And we had two shows running at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. And we won the Tony Award for Best Regional Theater. All that kind of acclaim and success started to drive us toward the fundraising campaign to raise enough money to build a building.
Mm.
So by 1990, we broke ground on a building.
Wow.
So from the time we started in 1974 to 1990, 15, 16 years, we built a building within 15 or 16 years. And we started out, I was 18 years old when it started. So it really is, when you look at the Steppenwolf store and you look at that giant building there and everything like that, and you go, this whole thing was started by kids.
Yeah.
It really is a great American dream story. Start with nothing but a passionate desire to do something, and in America you can achieve great things.
Were there any moments where you thought about giving up or stopping through that?
About giving up or stopping? Yeah. As I said, there were many bumps along the road. I mean, even after our first season in the basement, we were like, should we go on? Should we keep going? Nobody has any money. We don't have any money to do anything. We're borrowing clothes from our parents to wear as costumes. We're digging through people's dumpsters to build our sets,
Mm-hmm.
and it was all that kind of stuff. Nobody was making any money, and people started to question how long they wanted to do it.
Mm-hmm.
But again, what kept us going is that we really did enjoy being on stage together, and we made each other laugh, and we cracked each other up, and we inspired each other, because there were a bunch of really talented people in the original 9 people that were in the company. And a lot of them went on to do great things. Terry Kinney, Jeff Perry, Laurie Metcalf, Jonah Allen, John Mahoney. Do you remember Frasier, the show Frasier?
Yeah.
Remember Frasier's dad?
Yeah.
My dad was a member of the Steppenwolf Theater Company.
It must be so crazy to start that young all together, and then now in your 60s, see everyone where they're at and just see the journey from where and you all know where you started.
Yeah. We all kind of look at each other. I mean, we still stay in touch with each other. A lot of people are spread out in different places, and we don't see each other all that often. But I stay in touch. I'll stay in touch with John and Terry and Jeff, some of the original members from back then, Laurie a little bit. And so, we go back a long way, and it's funny to look back at when we were teenagers and youngsters and see where we all are today.
It's like, man, we have a lot of responsibilities now. We just started out as kids goofing around.
We were, and Moira and I, we got married in 81. She kept acting for a while, but then we started having our kids, and there was a time where I remember, we had 3 little ones, like every 2 years. So we had 3 little ones, and that's challenging. You have a lot to do when you're raising 3 little ones, and Moira was still trying to act, and I was trying to go for it and then be a dad and go for it. And at one point I said, honey, we should probably make a decision here. I think if I just put everything possible into going for this movie stuff, give it the best shot I possibly can, but it's going to take a lot of my time. And Moira was like, she was comfortable. She was trying to keep her acting career going, but she was a mom, and she was loving being a mom. And so she was perfectly fine with me, like, saying, okay, I'm going to go full on here. You help manage the kids here while I go full on. into the movie business and try to do that. And within a short while, that paid off. I started getting some good parts.
So, did you start out as an actor when you fully committed, and what was your first role in a film?
Well, yeah. I mean, like I said, I started acting in high school, did my
Yeah.
first play in high school, started the theater company, really worked hard at the theater company, then started directing some shows that got very popular. I got a movie deal in Hollywood. So
As a director or an actor?
yeah, as a director,
Oh, okay.
I did some pretty popular shows that got the attention of Hollywood producers and whatnot. As I said, we started taking our shows to New York in the '80s. I directed, three really popular, well-respected shows. That got the attention of some movie studios. They offered me a movie deal, and that's what took me from being the artistic director of Steppenwolf, finishing that in early 1987 and moving to California to take up this movie deal at Columbia Pictures. And so I went and started looking for movies to direct, and ended up directing something called Miles from Home. And then I went to work on Of Mice and Men and produced and directed and acted in that.
That was such a good movie, Of Mice and Men. And
It,
so
it
when
is.
you're acting and producing, are you acting in a scene and then when they cut, you're also directing? All right, now do this, do this, do this.
Yeah, kind of. We have a good system because you can, unlike the old days, you have video playback now, and that technology started developing back then, where you could record what you were shooting through the camera on video, and then you could immediately go and look at it and play it back. So that was very helpful as a director, because I could do the scene and then I could go look at it immediately and say, well, let's change this, let's move the camera over here, let's change the shot, let me do another take, that kind of thing. And so that was helpful.
So
I got pretty good at it on that movie.
did you cast Malkovich right away at the beginning? Did you know you wanted to co-star with him?
Yeah, because we did the play at Steppenwolf together in 1980, 81, 80, 81, right around in there. So it was automatic for me to first go to John to see if he wanted to do the movie of it. I told him I had the rights and said, hey, you want to be in it? Let's do it again. And he was up for it and he wanted to do it. So we went to work on it, and we shot it in 91. I got the rights to it in 1990. We started shooting a year later in 1991, and it came out a year later in 1992.
Wow.
So it was a two-year period.
And so after that film, how did the script for Forrest Gump come about? Were you seeking that out, or did it just come across your desk?
Yeah, my agent called, and I think the producer and the director, they had seen Of Mice and Men. Of Mice and Men came out in 92, October of 92, and they started looking for actors for Forrest Gump in like the spring of 93. So they had seen Of Mice and Men, and they asked, reached out to my agent to find out what I was doing and asked if I'd be interested. They sent me the script. It was to play a Vietnam veteran. I had Vietnam veterans in my family. I'd been supporting Vietnam veterans back in the 80s, and here, all of a sudden now I get an opportunity to audition to play Lieutenant Dan. I really wanted to do it. So, everything started to kind of. I did The Grapes of Wrath on Broadway in 1990. That led to me getting the rights to do Of Mice and Men. I did Of Mice and Men the next year. That led to for the big miniseries called The Stand, Stephen King miniseries. it's like a 1,300 page book Stephen King wrote, and they made a 4-part miniseries of The Stand, and they offered me the part. I didn't have to audition for it, which was unheard of for me at that time. You know, you offered the lead in a major Stephen King miniseries. That was very unusual. So I took it, and right after I finished shooting that, I got the call to come and audition for Forrest Gump. And
it's funny.
Forrest Gump.
It's funny looking back in hindsight, everything works out perfectly. We don't realize it at the time when it's all happening, but when we look back, it's everything happens perfectly for a reason.
Well, it did. I mean, it takes some people. Look, I didn't do my first movie until I was 36 or something. You know, a lot of people start off in their 20s and they're doing movies and that kind of thing. So I was focused on the theater company and building the theater company. And I was one of the leaders of the theater company and, you know, one of the actors. And, you know, I was doing a lot of good stuff there and really wanted to build the theater company. The theater company was the springboard to the movie business because, as I said, you know, I directed some pretty good plays at Steppenwolf, and that led to me getting offered a movie deal and then meeting movie producers and directors, and then meeting Elaine Steinbeck, who gave me the rights to Of Mice and Men. And then, you know, if you look at that period, you can read my book, Grateful American, and there's a whole bunch of chapters in there about the early days of Steppenwolf and, you know, stepping from theater into Hollywood and how all that kind of evolved over time. And it led to some great things in the 90s. I ended up doing a lot of great stuff in the 90s.
And whenever you were filming for Forrest Gump, were you pulling from your experiences of your brother-in-laws in Vietnam? Like, how did you prepare for that character? Because, I mean, most people have seen the movie, and you realize that from the perspective of someone who is deployed, gets injured, comes back, especially for that period of Vietnam veterans, it seems like you nailed that experience on the head.
Well, I was just looking at something about that. Yeah, I think having met my wife's two brothers, one was a West Point graduate, class of 66 at West Point. The class of 66 is a well-known class because they lost over 250 officers in Vietnam. That one class. That's a whole lot of sacrifice there from that class. And my brother-in-law was in that class and left and went off to Vietnam shortly after graduating. He went as a lieutenant and a platoon leader. And then he came home from his first tour and ended up, and then he had the rank of captain and went back to Vietnam for a second tour as a company commander. So a lot of tough stuff there. Then he went on and became a major. He taught at West Point. He was a lieutenant colonel in 1983. He was diagnosed with cancer in 83, and he died shortly after. But he was a very, very highly regarded, well-respected U.S. Army officer. In fact, I've met 4-star generals who my brother-in-law taught at West Point. And he was a TAC officer for General Mike Scaparrotti. Oh, wow. Do you know Scap? He was his last job was running all of Europe. He was the supreme 4-star Allied commander of Europe, and then he retired after that after 40 years. General Vince Brooks is another one. Vince was in West Point class of 80, and when I met Vince, he was a 1-star, and I said, "You went to West Point?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Did you? What class were you in?" He said, "1980." And I said, "Did you happen to know Boyd McKenna Harris?" And his face lit up, and he started gushing about my brother-in-law and how great he was and how much he learned from him. And then Vince went on to get his 4-star, and the last assignment he had was running all of Korea.
Oh, man.
So very, very very prominent guys I met over the years
Mm-hmm.
who knew my brother-in-law. And then my wife's the youngest of the two brothers was a helicopter pilot,
Mm.
800 combat hours.
Man.
He came home. The older of the two, Mac, we called him Mac. Our son is named after him because his name was Boyd McCanna Harris, but everybody called him Mac for short, for McCanna.
Mm-hmm.
And Mac was the older of the two, and then Arthur was a helicopter pilot. Mac stayed in the service when he got out, and as I said, he became a major, and then he taught at Leavenworth. He's in the Fort Leavenworth Hall of Fame. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
he was that prominent to the Army. But the youngest brother, the helicopter pilot, he got out of the service when he got home from Vietnam, and life was much more difficult for him.
Mm-hmm.
Just coming home from Vietnam and then getting out and trying to just forget about what you saw over there and what you did over there.
Yeah.
How many people were lost in front of you and difficult things and trying to forget about it and just go back to working in a drugstore or whatever. It was hard on the second brother.
So during that time, because I wasn't born yet, the tone of the country, it wasn't, I guess it was against the government, but it was also against the people coming home too, the veterans coming home from Vietnam.
Yeah. The veterans got crapped on. The country was really divided over whether we should be in Vietnam or at all. There was a draft at the time. So college kids were getting drafted. College kids who didn't want to be in the war, they didn't want to do it. They started protesting. There was all kinds of division in the country. And there were things that happened in Vietnam that kind of painted a picture of everyone who was serving in Vietnam. There was something that happened called a My Lai massacre, and you can look it up. It was a platoon leader, Lieutenant Calley, and they went into a village, and somebody had gotten shot on their side from somebody in the village.
Mm-hmm.
So they went in the village, burned everything down, and Lieutenant Calley ordered everybody into a big ditch, a big hole, and he had his platoon shoot them all.
Mm-hmm.
And it's known as the My Lai massacre. And there were kids and children and women. And I mean, it was awful. It was a bad thing. Our service members it was a difficult time. And the press got hold of that, of course, and then painted every single Vietnam veteran as a baby killer.
Mm-hmm.
And, you would come home from Vietnam and there would be protesters at the airport spitting on you, throwing bags of human feces on you.
Yeah.
I mean, so our service members, I remember my brother-in-law, same thing. And they told him, take your uniform off when you get to the airport.
Wow.
When you land, go into the bathroom and take your uniform on, put your civilian clothes on. And that's what he did, because the protesters were constantly there when our Vietnam veterans were coming home to spit on them and to scream at them and all of that. And to be somebody who just spent a year in the jungle, getting shot at and watching buddies get killed, to come home to a nation that was treating you like that was terrible for our Vietnam veterans.
And it's so hard to imagine the country like that, because the younger generations like myself, we see the support now for service members and veterans getting out. And it's just, I mean, watching documentaries and watching things on history about that, you can see it, but it's just so hard to imagine American citizens that hard against veterans.
Corey, I think a lot of the support today you'll find, well, for me, I'll just, having Vietnam veterans in my family and having learned a lot from them about what it was like to serve in Vietnam and then come home to that kind of crap that was happening all the time. I had a lot of compassion for, our Vietnam veterans. So I started supporting them back in the 80s in different ways, and trying to help them with different things. And then when I got to play Lieutenant Dan, it was a real honor for me to be able to do that. And your original question was, did I think about my wife's brothers who served in Vietnam when I was playing Lieutenant Dan? And the answer is yes, especially the older one, who was the platoon leader. Because Lieutenant Dan, of course, was a platoon leader, and all of that. I had a lot of compassion for our Vietnam veterans. And so when we started deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan, and people started getting hurt, people started getting killed, families started to lose loved ones. And then the nation, if you'll recall, in 2004, 2005, the nation started to kind of, all of a sudden, the nation was divided. What are we doing in Iraq? And, I don't know if you remember this, but this was very comparable in certain ways, although it wasn't a lot about killing. But do you remember the Abu Ghraib prison? You can look up Abu Ghraib prison, and what happened was we took over the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, and we had a lot of Iraqi prisoners in there, and our soldiers started to take pictures of them, making them do all kinds of crazy things. They put them on dog leashes and made these prisoners walk around. They took pictures of them. It was about 15 stupid soldiers in there that were doing that. And so much like the Vietnam veteran coming home after the My Lai massacre, and the media and everybody painting every Vietnam veteran with this Lieutenant Cali brush, every veteran serving in Iraq was being painted with the Abu Ghraib brush, right? Every veteran was a bad soldier doing bad things, when in fact, most of the soldiers over there were doing good things. Most of the service members, the Marines and the SEALs, Special Forces guys, they were doing good things, trying to do good things and help. I had been there myself, and I saw our soldiers rebuilding schools over there for the Iraqi kids. And we started supporting them with a program called Operation Iraqi Children. We would send hundreds of thousands of school supply kits, just bags of school supplies, over to the troops, and they would provide the kids in these schools with school supplies. We were doing everything we could to try to help them, because at the time I was seeing what was going on, and it felt very much like Vietnam in a way, because
you could see where this was going.
The media was painting everything that was happening in Iraq with a bad paintbrush and a bad light. And I didn't want our troops over there to feel like they were not being appreciated or supported. So that's when I just went crazy, going on trips and coming up with programs like Operation Iraqi Children, all the different things that happened back then to support the men and women who were serving our country. I wanted people that were in Iraq and Afghanistan, to know that there was a grateful nation out there, in spite of what the media might be saying, or the divisions in the political environment in our country.
With your parents, your mother and your father, outside of military service and people in the military and the family, because you have a really big servant's heart, were they the same way? Or do you think you got any of that from them, or just your life experiences molded you to be the way you are now?
I think a little bit. Like I said, my dad was in the Navy. He was in the Navy when I was born. He got out of the Navy about 10 days after I was born. So I always say, I guess I'm a Navy brat, because I was born when my dad was in the Navy. But as I got old enough to sort of think about things, my dad never really talked about his days in the Navy much, or what he did. As I said, my grandfather never talked about any of that. The folks on my side of the family never really talked about their service stuff.
Yeah.
My dad was a film editor, and he started his own editing business. And in fact, he started to learn film while he was in the Navy. That was his job in the Navy. He was
Interesting.
he was what you call a photo mate.
So
So
is that tie of him being in film and in the film industry kind of what gave you the interest in theater whenever you were younger growing up?
no, no, no. No, it had nothing to do with that. I remember as a young kid, sometimes I would go down to my dad's editing office, and he'd be editing film, and it would be like all over the floor, and he'd be editing and stuff. But I always thought, what is this? I was never really that into it when I was a kid.
Mhm.
I stumbled into theater by accident in high school, and it didn't have anything to do with my dad. Your original question was, did I get kind of maybe a charitable heart a little bit from my mom and dad? My mom and dad were always very open and very giving. Like, as I recall, when I was in high school and whatnot, they always like opened their door to the kids to come over. All the kids would love to come to our house because my
Mhm.
mom and dad were just put out food, and they loved it. And I think part of what they loved about it is that, prior to me stumbling into theater in high school, I was just a failing student. you know, I was about to get kicked out of high school. I just was not doing well. And then all of a sudden I discovered something that I was
Mhm.
good at and that I enjoyed. And they loved coming to see the plays. So they pretty much opened their doors and they were supportive.
Nice.
And maybe some of what I have comes from just having seen my mom and dad be very charitable and sort of
Mhm.
giving in that way. But I'm also kind of, I think, being a theater guy, you have to have empathy and compassion for
Mhm.
your subjects in a way.
Yeah.
You can't judge them. When you're playing somebody, you can't really judge them because what if they're a bad guy, right?
Mhm.
And you don't like anything about them or what they do. You hate everything they're doing, but you still have to play them.
Yeah.
So you can't judge them. You can't contain yourself from being evil. You just have
Mhm.
to embrace it and go with it. And I've played some bad guys too. Um, yeah, that's just something
Do you
that
prefer playing the bad guys or the character arc of maybe the supporting hero? What's your favorite role to play?
you mean good guy or bad guy?
Yeah,
Well,
good guy, bad guy,
I played I
complicated guy.
played some good bad guys, but I think the role, one of the bad guys that I probably enjoyed the most is in a Mel Gibson with Mel. We did a movie in the '90s called Ransom. Probably the year you were
Ooh.
born. You said you were born in '96.
96.
Yeah, that's the year Ransom came out in 1996, and it's a good movie. It's a very tense thriller that was directed by Ron Howard.
'Cause you're the kidnapper in that, right?
I'm I'm the misunderstood police officer. I
Okay.
prefer to see it that way.
Yeah, of course, of course. So with, on Forrest Gump, were there any moments as Lieutenant Dan that you improvised that made it into the final cut?
Improvise. Yes, there is one moment I remember. It was fun. I got to be very good friends with Michael T. Williamson, who played Bubba.
Mhm.
We just got to be really good friends on that movie and have stayed friends all these years. And we would just goof around, him as Bubba and me as Lieutenant Dan. And we would kind of be sitting in our director's chairs in between scenes or whatever, just waiting for them to set up a shot. And we'd goof around and, kind of he'd play Bubba and I'd play Lieutenant Dan, and we'd just make up stuff. And I don't know if you remember Bubba, but he had this lip that was sticking out
Mhm.
like this. It came way out here. And Michael T wanted to talk like that, have this lip sticking out. And he even had somebody make him this little prosthetic device that he tucked down in his lip
Ah,
that would push his lip out.
like a Marlon Brando style thing.
Yeah, kind of like that. Like he stuffed his his face full of Kleenex or something, to make himself talk like that. And Michael T did that, and we were just improvising one day, just goofing around. And I was goofing around in the director's chairs with him. I said, "What's wrong with your lip?" "I was born with big gums, sir." "Well, you better tuck that in. You're going to get that caught on a tripwire." And we improvised that offset, just sitting there. And then we started laughing at each other, and we went to Bob, the director, Bob Zemeckis, and we did it for him. And he said, "Oh, I love that. Let's put it in." So we put it in the first scene where Lieutenant Dan meets Forrest and Bubba. We stuck that in there, and we had improvised that on the set that day.
Oh man, that's funny. And working with him, what was it like working with Tom Hanks? Because it seems like every movie he's in, he stands out. What do you think makes him Tom Hanks?
Well, he was a joy to work with. Just a really easygoing guy, very, very smart, obviously very talented, had created a just marvelous character. And we had a lot of fun just doing Lieutenant Dan and Forrest, here and there. And Tom was just a joy to work with. I had only met him one time before Forrest Gump. I was doing the Grapes of Wrath down in La Jolla, California. And Tom knew one of the actors. I think they had done something in Cleveland, maybe at the Cleveland Playhouse or something years ago. And Tom knew one of the actors who was in the show and came backstage, and I met him. And he, at that time, let's see, that was 1989. So Tom he was well known. He was doing a lot of comedies in those days. So let's see, that was 89. And then just 3 or 4 years later, I auditioned for Forrest Gump. And Tom's career was going great, but he was making a shift in his career at that point, from just playing a lot of comic roles, which he had been used to and kind of well known for, to more getting into more dramatic stuff. And his right around that period of time, he did something called Philadelphia. He won the Oscar for that. And then he won back-to-back Oscars. The next year, he won the Oscar for Forrest Gump. And his career changed a lot. And I ended up doing, when Forrest Gump came out, Tom was getting ready to do Apollo 13.
Great movie. Such a good movie.
Another good movie. And I ended up going to audition for that and got in that. So Tom and I did back-to-back movies there together. And then a little bit later, he did another movie, The Green Mile. And I ended up doing a small part in that, just a couple of days on the movie. But
talking about the dog and biting your son.
Yeah, it shot in Tennessee.
Oh,
I remember flying to Nashville, and then we shot around here somewhere. And I spent a couple of days with Tom on the set, and that was great. He was a joy to work with.
And so 9/11 happens. Do you remember where you were whenever it happened?
Yeah, I was asleep because I was in California. So, it was about 6:30 in the morning, or it was early in the morning in California. And my wife and kids, they were getting ready to go to school. My wife was kind of up with the kids, and I was sleeping in. And they came in and told me to turn on the television, and that my buddy Terry Kinney was on the phone, and he was calling me, and he was on the phone, wanted to talk to me. And I woke up, and my wife turned on the TV, and Terry was on the other line. He said, "You got to see what's happening here." Terry was living in New York, and I looked at the television, and I see the smoke pouring out of one of the towers, and then another plane hit the building. And we're under attack. And I remember I had a golf game scheduled that morning with a buddy of mine, and I'm glued to the television, and now it's time to kind of pull myself away from the TV and go golf, And so I was supposed to meet him at a certain time, and I got in the car and I went there, got on the driving range, and I had watched the towers collapse.
Mm-hmm.
The towers had come down, and then he had left his house before that happened. So when I got there, we're on the driving range, and I'm telling him that the towers came down. And they had stopped all the air traffic. There were no planes in the sky. Usually in this one golf course that we were on, there's planes going overhead, no planes going over anywhere. And we're just talking about what was going on and trying to hit some balls. And I said, you know what? I can't play today.
Mm-hmm.
I got to go home. So
And
I got in my car and I turned on the radio and drove home. And, it was terrible day.
And I vaguely remember it as a kid. They rolled in a television whenever we were in class, and I forgot what grade we were in, but so I vaguely remember. And then a few years back you can watch the full news live stream on YouTube somewhere. It's just, and to see people jumping out of the building and just that entire timeline is just never seen anything like it. But after that, did you start with the USO trying to get involved after 9/11, or was it the 04, 05 timeframe you started?
It was my first trip for the USO was right after the invasion of Iraq.
How was that first USO tour?
Yeah, so we had gone into Afghanistan, and we were chasing bin Laden around.
Mm-hmm.
And shortly after the attacks, but it wasn't until a little bit later I started to wind up a bit to support the men and women who were serving. And I remember on the first anniversary of September 11th, it was September 11th, 2002. And I went to Chicago, and I was the MC of a giant memorial service in Daley Plaza in the city of Chicago. There were 100,000 people in the plaza.
Wow.
And everybody was coming together to remember and to honor what had happened a year prior. And I was starting to wind up with different things to support. But then I remember calling the USO and saying, I want to go visit our troops. I want to go on some tours. And finally, in the spring of 2003, I think it was, I got through to the USO, and it was funny. I left a few messages and I never heard back. And I finally called back again, left another message. And I said, I figured, I realized maybe they don't know who Gary Sinise is. So I called and said, I'm Gary Sinise, and I'm the guy who played Lieutenant Dan in Forrest Gump.
They're like, sorry.
Yeah, I want to go on a tour. So they called back after that. And then they were setting up a big tour to go to Iraq in June of 2003. And I got on that tour, and I met a lot of people. And then I got back from that tour in June, and I went on another tour in July. And then I went another tour in August and September and October. And then I went back to Iraq in November. I wasn't working a regular job at that point. So I just was nonstop. And that led to then I started taking my band the following year, and, multiple charitable support on nonprofits that were trying to help our troops out, and all of
Mhm.
that eventually just galvanized into me wanting to start my own nonprofit.
Wow. And um, how often do people call you Lieutenant Dan? And that's what they think you are.
I'll get that sometimes. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that happens here and there. I mean,
Yeah.
less so now because the movie's over 30
Yeah.
years old now and everything like that. But new generations of kids watch it on television and
Mhm.
stream it, and it's a beloved movie. So parents who were kids at the time when it came out, they're now parents. They have their own kids. They're
Mhm.
showing them the movie, and I go. I have a band. It's called the Lieutenant Dan Band. We go to military bases all over the place. They'll
And
figure it out, I think.
with the band, how did that come about? Whenever you were on these USO tours, you're trying to figure out what else you could do on these tours to connect with the troops?
Yeah, pretty much. On the very first tour I was on, uh, in June of '03, it was called Project Salute,
Mhm.
and it was a teaming up of, gosh, there were a bunch of different sponsors on it. It was the USO, and Vanity Fair was a sponsor, I remember, and I think the Intrepid Foundation was a sponsor, and there were a whole bunch of entertainers on that trip. Robert De Niro was on the trip. I mean, there were a lot of entertainers on the trip, including like Kid Rock and Leanne Womack, and there was a rap group called Nappy Roots that was people that were actually entertaining
Mhm.
and performing for the troops and all that. And I was just there as Lieutenant Dan to shake hands and take pictures and all that. And I had some musicians that I played with, and I would just play with them for fun, just we'd get together every once in a while. So I just started talking to the USO and saying, hey, I maybe can I take my band? I've got a little group that I play with. And
Mhm.
eventually, after I'd done 6 or 7 handshake tours where I was just Lieutenant Dan shaking hands, um, they let me take the musicians along with me. And so our first tour with the band was February of 2004. We went to Diego Garcia
Mhm.
in the middle of the Indian Ocean. We went to Singapore, naval base over there. And
Sending you as far away as possible.
yeah, they did. They did. They sent us pretty far away. And then we went to Korea too.
Mm.
So that was our first tour. And then I got back and I said, I want to do a domestic tour.
Mhm.
So 3 months later, we were busing and trucking around to military bases in the States. And then I just kept asking them to do it again and again, and
Wow.
kept having to find ways to fund it because the USO doesn't pay anything. They pay like $50 a day per diem, and that's it. And I kept wanting to go. I didn't get paid, but I wanted my band to go, and
Mhm.
they couldn't afford to go for $50. So I had to keep finding a way to pay them. I would pay them myself or raise money or whatever. I just wanted to keep doing it. And that turned into a pretty big mission. We played over 580 concerts since
Wow.
those days for the troops.
And so all that time, the hospital visits, playing for the troops, and the USO tours, what is there any really inspiring stories or service members or guys who really persevered that stand out to you that were inspired you during this time frame? I'm sure there's dozens.
Oh, hundreds or
Hundreds, yeah. Yeah, you're right, hundreds.
thousands maybe.
Yeah.
I've met so many of the families of our fallen heroes. I mean,
Mhm.
and they persevere through their grief. And it's very, very difficult. And I saw what somebody like me showing up and wrapping my arms around them could do. And then I see how they persevere through that. I've been in a hospital so many times. I did my first visit to Walter Reed on September 11th, 2003.
Wow.
So I'd been to Iraq in June of '03. I went to Italy in July of '03. I went to Germany in August of '03. And then I was at Fort Stewart and Walter Reed in Bethesda in September of '03.
Oh, wow.
And I remember going in there and meeting a lot of wounded folks. I was, in fact, the first hospital that I was at was on my Germany tour in August of '03. I went to Landstuhl, and
Mhm.
you know Landstuhl. I mean, that's
Mhm.
where people go when they first come out of the battle zone, and they, they're stabilized there, and then they come home to one of the hospitals. So I had seen people that were fresh out of the bombings, and that were really struggling and just
Mhm.
trying to hang out and survive. And it was interesting because about 2 weeks after I was at Landstuhl, I was at Walter Reed for my first time. And I remember walking down one of the hallways at Walter Reed, and one of our wounded guys comes wheeling down the hall in a wheelchair. And I look at him and I said, wait a minute. And he looks at me and says, hey, Lieutenant Dan. And I had just seen him 2 weeks before at Landstuhl in a hospital bed.
Oh, wow.
He was in the bed. Now he's at Walter Reed in a chair.
Mhm.
He's making progress. And so I would revisit all the time the hospitals every 2 or 3 months,
Mhm.
and just see so many resilient people just plowing through the challenges of being wounded and then trying to bounce back from it. And that was truly inspiring, one after another.
Yeah.
And to see their families there enduring these long rehabilitations. And that's why we created a program at the Gary Sinise Foundation called our Invincible Spirit Festivals. And
Mhm.
for years now, I've been taking my band, free food, rock climbing walls, and moon bounces and stuff. And we set up outside the hospital and create a whole festival atmosphere for a day.
Nice.
And the patients that can come out of the rooms, they'll come out. And quite often, I mean, it started at Naval Medical Center in San Diego.
Mhm.
You know that place. Uh,
Yep.
that's where I started that program back in 2012. And I just was standing outside the hospital after a visit, and I looked over at this area. Do you know that area? There's a big circle driveway in front.
Mhm.
I said,
Because there's the
I'll bet we could put a stage right over here, and then we'll get some food. And that's how we started doing it. I'm about to go to BAMC in San Antonio
Oh,
in 2 weeks, and we'll do one of our festivals there. Um,
nice.
I've just met so many extraordinary people over the years, so many
Mhm.
incredible heroes that have inspired me. I write about a lot of them in
Mhm.
my book, Grateful American.
And hearing all these stories, and you've seen so many people at their darkest times and their highest times and persevering. I know a lot of guys that have gotten out and they're struggling with injuries or divorce, brain injuries, addictions, things like that. From all the experiences you've had, do you have any advice or takeaways or things that might help those people get through those times?
Yes, and Corey, the first thing I would say to anybody who is struggling and reluctant to ask for help, you're their battle buddy, bud.
Mhm.
We have a crap load of programs at the Gary Sinise Foundation that are there to help folks through. We have mental wellness programs. We have home building programs. We have all kinds of resiliency programs, grants that we provide, all of this, mental health retreats.
Mhm.
We do all kinds of things at the Gary Sinise Foundation. So anybody that you think as one of their pals should seek out some assistance,
Mhm.
you know, uh, put them in touch with the Gary Sinise Foundation. We will do everything possible to help them through, and we have a lot of programs at the Gary Sinise Foundation. Look, there are multiple programs around the country.
Yeah.
There's no shortage of nonprofits in the support space for our veterans
Mhm.
and military families and first responders out there. There are a lot of programs out there. Gary Sinise Foundation is one of them, and if we can't provide those services ourselves, we're tapped into so many other
Mhm.
organizations that are doing good work that we can always point people in the right direction.
And that's one of the things that surprised me after I got my brain injury, I had no idea that there was this, because I was at Wounded Warrior Battalion out in California, and I
Yeah.
had no idea that there was all of this support network for people with amputations, brain injuries, all of this whenever you get out. But you
I
really have to
don't.
ask.
I'm not sure. I know the military's gotten a little bit better with that kind of, but I don't think they're totally focused
No.
on saying, okay, if you get hurt when you're serving in the military, we're going to give you, 20 different nonprofits to contact, to help you through if you're transitioning out of the service into the civilian community, but that's our job, as nonprofits. It's our job to try to raise awareness for what we're doing. I like I said before, I had my own nonprofit. I was supporting. If you look at my book, if you look at the back of the book, you'll see a call to action list at the back of the book. I put that in there because those are multiple nonprofit. There's probably 24 or more nonprofits listed there that I was supporting before I started my own nonprofit. And I would do that because I wanted to help as many people as possible. So I tried to help as many nonprofits as possible who were in all these different spaces, helping, the children of our fallen heroes, or entertainment, or home building, or whatever it might be. That's in there. There's no shortage of nonprofits out there. The problem is that people don't know about it. If you're living in a small community in Nebraska or someplace like that, unless you really seek it out, really go on the internet and start researching what's in your area or what are the national organizations out there that you can reach out to, you just might not know about it. You might not hear about it. So I've really found that, with my spotlight in the movie business and TV business, I've been able to kind of take that spotlight and shine it on some good nonprofits out there that are doing great work, and it was helpful in building my own nonprofit.
Yeah, and speaking of that, the Lieutenant Dan Band, did they play at the Grand Ole Opry recently here in Nashville?
We were there on in July this past year. Last summer, July 6th was the 30th anniversary of the opening of Forrest Gump. So we had been talking to the Opry about maybe doing something with the Lieutenant Dan Band, and then I'm not sure who came up with this idea, but it was really good. I think it was probably the Opry, and they knew that I was kind of focused on, is there going to be something that we can do around the anniversary? And so we teamed up with the Opry and did an event there called the Grand Ole Opry celebrates 30 years of Forrest Gump. And we had all kinds of Gump stuff out in the lobby, the Forrest Gump bench, and, there was boxes of chocolates everywhere. I mean, whatever it was. People dressed like Forrest Gump, and they, they came. And it was a big, it was also a partial fundraiser for the Gary Sinise Foundation and our programs to help our veterans. And so the audience was filled with veterans who know the foundation. They know me and what I've been trying to do. It was filled with Gump fans, and it was filled with country music fans. And it was packed, and it was a great, great night. A lot of fun. They actually put it on television on the Opry Live. I think they broadcast it they reran it. We did it in July, and they reran it in December as an Opry Live. So it's probably out there. You can look it up. And it was great because all the artists on the bill that night did songs from the Forrest Gump soundtrack, and it was very nostalgic. And
that's a very unique moment.
Yeah, my buddy Michael T. Williamson, who played Bubba, I had him come, and he plays harmonica, and he's played with us a few times. So he got up and played. He was a real surprise hit with the crowd. And the guy who played young Forrest, who, remember, he runs with the braces on his legs and everything like that. His name is Michael Connor Humphreys. He came and introduced one of the acts. One of the producers was there. It was a great night. A lot of fun.
Nice. And I heard that, if this is true, the accent for Forrest that Tom developed was because of the child actor's accent?
Yeah, Michael Connor Humphreys. Yeah, he had kind of a a little twang and everything that he had in those days, and they were trying to figure out, well, how are we going to get Michael to talk like Tom?
Mhm.
And Tom said, well, why don't I just talk like Michael? So that's how it went. Hey,
So m- a- moving past that, you've inspired so many people. You've worked with thousands of veterans and helped them through their darkest times, and you've had your share of those too. So with your wife, she's now cancer free, but how was she originally diagnosed? Do you remember kind of those moments and how that happened?
yeah, that was a tough year. She had a mammogram, and then we didn't hear anything about the mammogram for a little while, and they thought, okay, well, we didn't hear anything, and then all of a sudden we get a letter saying, uh, we'd like you to come back and do a second mammogram. And so we were like, why? What's going
Mhm.
on with that? Well, we went in and did that, and then they looked at it and they recommended we go see this doctor. And I remember he came in and said, well, you have breast cancer. We found something, um, and we recommend surgery. Um, we don't recommend a mastectomy,
Mhm.
but a lumpectomy will remove what we think are, we're going to go in and try to get the lymph nodes out that we think are infected. And so they went in with a lumpectomy, and they took out 19 nodes,
Mhm.
and 5 of them were infected.
Man,
So she had, we said, well, what's going on? And they said, well, this is actually stage 3 breast cancer.
jeez.
So we recommend chemotherapy now. So she had to go through 8 treatments of chemotherapy, and that knocked her for a loop.
Mhm.
And then she had to go through 35 radiation treatments.
Jesus.
So from, I guess it was about June of 2018 to early January 2019, she was in treatment. And thankfully, you know, uh, all that, the combination of all that worked.
Mhm.
And she's been cancer free ever since. But during that time, after her first chemo treatment in the summer of 2018, our son had been complaining. Our son, Mac, named after my brother in law,
Mhm.
he had been complaining about tailbone pain. And he'd been complaining for a while about it. Everybody thought it was like a bruised tailbone or something. But finally, it was getting so uncomfortable with him, and he was having trouble sleeping and just getting comfortable with this pain. My wife had had several spine surgeries. She's had a lot of medical issues
Mhm.
beyond the cancer, just one medical thing after another over the last 15 years or so. And while she was I remember we sent our son to her spine surgeon, and Moira and I were sitting outside. She was just kind of coming out of having a really hard time from her first chemo treatment. And we were trying to figure out, well, how are we going to get through 7 more of these treatments?
Mhm.
We're sitting outside, and I got a call from Moira's spine surgeon that Mac had a tumor
Jeez.
on his sacrum. That was causing all the pain in his tailbone. It wasn't a bruised tailbone
Mhm.
or a fractured tailbone. It was a giant orange size
God.
tumor that the surgeon thought was called a chordoma. And there happened to be a chordoma expert at UCLA that he sent us to, who confirmed that it was a tumor called chordoma that starts in either in the base of the spine or the top, right up here under the brain. And, you know, a lot of the times they can go in and they can remove this chordoma and they'll get it all and it'll be cured. It's gone.
Mm-hmm.
There's only about 300 people per year that are diagnosed with chordoma.
Jeez.
So 70% of the time they can remove that tumor and take it out and get rid of it. 30% of the time it will come back, it'll recur, and it will spread.
And that's 30% of average 300 a year.
Yeah. So, you know, under 100 people, I mean, 90 people a year maybe have what our son had. It came back 8 months later after his initial surgery and started to spread. And that led to chemo and radiation and more surgeries and just a 5.5-year battle that unfortunately we lost him in January 5th, 2024.
Really sorry about your loss, and I've read about it, and he was a musician too. And the story about him being able to do that work a week before he went into the hospital is really beautiful.
Yeah, about 6 weeks after he died, I posted up a story on the Gary Sinise Foundation website about him. He had worked for the foundation, and he was very dedicated to the foundation. He was a musician, a drummer, a great composer, and he worked for the foundation. And I felt a need to let our donors know what was going on behind the scenes. All these years, I had never told anybody outside of the circle, you know, the inner circle of people. Never talked about our cancer fight publicly in 5.5 or 6 years. And now it was over and we lost our son. And I felt it was time to kind of reveal what had gone on and to talk about Mac and his work at the foundation and all that. So after that, we just received a ton of support and love. And the final year of Mac's life, he had been disabled by the cancer, but he wanted to go back and start working on music again in his hospital bed. He was in a wheelchair. He was paralyzed from the chest down, and he wanted to go back and try to do some music again. And by the end of 2023, what started in February of 2023 with an idea to resurrect and revive an old piece of music that he wrote in college that he never finished, that year turned into an entire album of music called Mac Sinise Resurrection and Revival. He finished it. He heard it all. He designed the record. There were videos that were made of the recording sessions that we viewed 2 days before we had to call the ambulance and take him to the hospital for his last time. So he completed everything he set out to do that year. And then after that, I found all this other music that he'd written. And I didn't want to leave that on his laptop. And it's beautiful stuff. And so I went to work, you know, in 2024 and produced a second record for Mac Sinise Resurrection and Revival Part 2. And both of those records are available. The vinyls are available at GarySiniseFoundation.org with all the proceeds, like Mac wanted, going to the Gary Sinise Foundation to help our mission. And you can also download those records on Amazon, iTunes, Spotify, all those digital platforms.
And I've listened to it in the Arctic Circles and just the strings and the instrumentation. I mean, it's beautiful.
Oh, yeah. He was a great writer. It really was. I mean, you know, I sit and listen to this music and I just think of all the things that Mac would have done, you know, had he not had cancer. He would truly been one of our young leaders here at the Gary Sinise Foundation. He would have written more music. There's so much that he would have done. but we're blessed at what he did do
Hmm.
in his life, and he inspired a lot of people, and he continues to do that.
And it seems like the timing of all of that, of finishing it, that he was really holding on to finish what he set out to do with that music.
Yeah. I think his last year in some ways, and we didn't, of course, know it was going to be
Yeah.
his last year. We did know that the cancer was not going away because you could see tumors and they were getting bigger, and they weren't shrinking. And no matter what we were trying to do, it was hard. So we knew that part was getting harder, but uh, what was beautiful is that in some ways, that final year for Mac was one of the best years he ever had
Hmm.
because of what he set out to do and what he accomplished and what he wanted to do. His music was played on national television 2 days before he went to the hospital.
Wow.
In fact, it was the day before he went to the hospital. A buddy of mine heard the music and asked me to come on national television and talk about it. And he wanted to play the videos and play the music. And
Wow.
Mac was in the other room watching while I was in a satellite truck in front of our house doing the interview. And Mac was in the house watching the interview and
Oh
watching it
man.
be played on national television.
How did he
And
feel about that?
he was so proud of that.
Oh,
Really just gave him such joy.
that's amazing. And that he got to see that and
Yeah.
see it completed and know that got sent out to the people. Well, I know you will be wrapping up soon. I wanted to ask, after going through that battle with your wife and with your son and just these years of service, what do you think are some big lessons that you try and live your life by that you've learned from these personal battles and seeing these battles with other people?
Well, it's about giving, I think. I found years ago when I started, I had some difficult things that were happening, and I just started trying to use my public platform to do some good for somebody else.
Mhm.
And I started going different places, and the more I did that, the better I felt
Yeah.
about things. And some people have service it's just in their DNA. A lot of our military families, if you look at our military, I don't know that much about your family, Corey, but we all know those military families where, hey, dad served, grandpa served, Uncle Joe served, my brother served, my sister served. It's just in the
Mhm.
DNA. My son's serving now, all that kind of stuff. Service is in the DNA of, and that service can be a great healer when you're dealing with something that's really challenging. And I know through everything with Mac and my
Mhm.
wife. My dad had a stroke during this period of time.
Oh, man.
My mom's disabled. A lot of different things. I know that going out there and helping somebody else and having a foundation and the support of the American people that's here to help other people, that is a good that helps you. It helps you
Mhm.
through those challenging times. And I'd recommend it to anybody. If you're dealing with some difficult things, one way to help yourself sort of heal and sort of get through it is by helping somebody else with something. And we can't always do that when we're grieving or we're dealing with tough stuff.
Mhm.
But remember how it feels when somebody comes up to you and wraps their arms around you and just gives you a good pat on the back.
Yeah.
That little gesture can go a long way. Just that simple little thing, and it can make a big difference. Not everybody can start a foundation and
Mhm.
go out and raise a lot of money and all that. But there are small, simple things that you can do that'll make you feel good and it'll make somebody else feel good too.
Absolutely. And the last question, after after you're gone, what do you hope your legacy is and what do you want people to remember about Gary?
Oh dear, I don't know. You know, people have asked me that before. I don't. I try not to think about that. I'm going to be 70 in a couple of weeks.
You got 40 more years at least.
I am. Right. You try not to think of, geez, I'm going to be 70. You know, oh my gosh. You know, I know people that are 70.
Yeah.
You know, and then I know people that are 80, and that's not that far away.
No, and 80 is the new 40.
All that's well. We hope. We hope. You know, I don't. You know what? I have. You know, this is this Gary Sinise Foundation. It's a family business in a way, because this wouldn't exist without the support of my wife and children.
Mhm.
If they had not been supportive of me getting on airplanes all the time and going to some base or going to some war zone, or, you know, going out to do some event somewhere to help somebody raise money or something like that, if they had not been supportive of me doing that, the Gary Sinise Foundation wouldn't exist. We wouldn't have over 75 employees that are working to accomplish the mission of the Gary Sinise Foundation. We wouldn't have been able to deploy hundreds of millions of dollars all over the place to help a lot of people if the family hadn't been supportive. And now I'm thankful that both my daughter's husbands are working for the foundation, you know, doing great work here, helping to carry that on. We have a lot of people at the foundation who've been with the foundation a good long time and seem very, very dedicated and are loving it and carrying it on. I hope that what happens, should I get called, you know, to the great reward and when God calls me, I hope that we've set this up in such a way that it can carry on. The family can continue to be, you know, working with it, and that it will carry on and help a lot of people in the future. And that's the thing that gives the movie business and the TV business and the acting career and all that stuff I've done there, that gives a lot of meaning to that kind of success. If you can take that success and turn it into something that it can help somebody else, that would be a good thing. I think God would pat me on the back for that. At least I hope so.
Absolutely. I think it will too. And Gary, I want to thank you you've been an inspiration for decades to America. And I know that thousands of service members and first responders are grateful that you exist and that people like you exist. And I want to thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Corey, I appreciate that. And I appreciate you serving as well, my friend. God bless you. It's great to see you doing well. I know you went through some tough stuff, and I'm proud of you that you're carrying on and you're spreading the messages of your brothers and sisters in arms, and you let me come on too. So that's a good thing.
I'm glad I could pencil you in.
Thanks for doing it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Have a good one.
You bet, bud. God bless.
God bless.
Bye-bye.